tuning into CRJU News. I'm your host, Alli Holtz, and today we are going to be covering one of the most controversial conversations in the criminal justice system of solitary confinement. So today you are going to hear from a panel of researchers and psychologists about their findings of solitary confinement, both pros and cons, and how it could be detrimental to our criminal justice system. So first, I'm going to pass you off to Vanessa to tell you all about the development of solitary confinement and its effects.
Thank you, Alli. Solitary confinement, one of the more controversial topics that we have in our justice system. So how did it originate? The National Library of Medicine explains that originating in the 1790s, solitary confinement was introduced as an alternative for a number of physical punishments. Originally, it was created as a punishment that would create an environment of self-revelation and self-improvement. Eventually, it expanded and became something much more. By the 1800s, specifically in Pennsylvania, inmates were kept in these cells for the whole day and were not allowed out, even for religious purposes. By 1820, a more relevant and similar version of the solitary confinement punishment that we have today started to spring when prisons began to have bigger cells while also simultaneously having smaller and more narrow cells as well. By the 19th century, people began to view some of the more negative side effects that the solitary confinement punishment really had. For more on the positives and negatives, here is Daisy Delgado.
Thank you for passing it on to me, Vanessa. I am Daisy Delgado, a psychologist that works closely with inmates and what happens to them once they are in jail for 22 to 23 hours or in prison and placed into a small cell. I will be talking about the pros and cons about solitary confinement and how the consequences can positively and negatively impact an inmate physically, mentally, and emotionally. To begin with, the pros about solitary confinement is that it keeps control and there is order, which means that if inmates decide to break rules in prison, they will be out alone, which prevents anything from happening moving forward. Another pro about solitary confinement is that it is used as a short-term threat, which can help an inmate cool off before going out to the public and preventing more harm from happening. This helps an inmate watch their control levels and encourage them to follow rules that cause less violence. Now that I talked about the pros of solitary confinement, let's talk about the cons of solitary confinement. When an inmate is put in jail for 22 to 23 hours a day with little to no interaction with others, it affects their mental health and causes issues like depression, anxiety, and even have suicide thoughts. When doing research, it was shown that once they are released, their mental health gets worse, which they are more than likely to go out and are capable of reoffending. It also makes it harder for these individuals to have access to education and therapy, which is needed for rehabilitation. In conclusion, solitary confinement has its ways for the short-term, however long-term effects on humans and can violate their rights, which then the topic gets controversial. Thank you for listening to me as your psychologist. I hope this information was helpful, and I would now like to pass it on to Carlos. Take it away, Carlos.
Hello there, my name is Carlos Luna, and I am a specialist in the psychological effects of solitary confinement. In today's news segment, we will be speaking on how solitary confinement isn't just a punishment, it's a psychological crisis. Studies have consistently shown that prolonged isolation causes severe mental and cognitive deterioration. Today I'll break down two major ways solitary confinement impacts the brain: psychological distress leading to psychosis, and cognitive decline that can become irreversible. First, depression, anxiety, and psychosis. The human brain is built for social interaction. Even minimal human contact, like seeing someone's face or hearing their voice, helps regulate emotions, stress levels, and cognitive stability. But in solitary confinement, inmates are stripped of all meaningful human connection for 22 to 24 hours a day. This extreme isolation disrupts normal brain function, leading to severe depression, heightened anxiety, and an increased risk of suicide. Some prisoners, especially those confined for long periods, develop psychotic symptoms such as hallucinations and paranoia. The brain, deprived of stimulation, begins to create its own reality. In a 2012 study published in the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, researchers found that up to 41% of prisoners in solitary exhibit symptoms of psychosis compared to just 5% in the general prison population. This means that isolation itself is pushing individuals into a state of severe mental illness. Second, cognitive decline and irreversible damage. Beyond mental health deterioration, solitary confinement also damages cognitive function. Researchers shows that inmates in prolonged isolation experience significant memory loss, difficulty concentrating, and trouble regulating emotions. This is because the brain isn't just suffering emotionally, it's actually shrinking in critical areas. A 2016 Harvard study found that solitary confinement causes the hippocampus to shrink, the part of the brain responsible for memory, learning, and impulse control. This means that the longer someone is isolated, the harder it becomes for them to think clearly, make decisions, or even function normally once released. What's even more alarming is that some of this damage may be permanent. Many formerly incarcerated individuals struggle to reintegrate into society because they develop paranoia, extreme sensitivity to stimuli, and difficulty maintaining relationships. This is why prisoners who have experienced solitary confinement are more likely to reoffend, not because they are inherently violent, but because solitary strips them of the psychological tools needed to adapt to life outside. At the end of the day, solitary confinement isn't just about discipline, it's about long-term psychological harm. The evidence is clear. Prolonged isolation leads to mental breakdown, cognitive impairment, and an increased likelihood of reoffending. If we want safer communities and a justice system that truly rehabilitates, we need to rethink how we treat incarcerated individuals. The science is undeniable. Solitary confinement does more harm than good. Now, back to you in the studio.
After hearing the positives, negatives, and psychological aspects of solitary confinement, it is only fair that we begin to look into more psychologically healthy practices. Currently, there is a step in the redirection of solitary confinement. Starting in the Oregon's Department of Corrections, there is a new process that includes a restricted housing re-entry program. These new rehabilitation methods steer away from isolation and lead more towards alleviating the previous psychological harm to begin the process of self-reflection and improvement. While this program is still ongoing due to the previous COVID-19 pandemic, we start to see more improvement in psychological and physical behaviors and hope to continue seeing more positive results. That is all for today, and now passing it back to Alli.
Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed all that our researchers and psychologists had to say. Following this will be a list of our references. As always, do your research and stay out of jail.